Okay, good evening, everyone. So we are ready to start. Welcome to this webinar, which is, I think, going to be a very interesting one because it's focusing on gender-sensitive NDCs and the development of gender action plans at country level. So when we were planning this webinar, someone asked me, what next? Are we going to have gender-sensitive apple trees? So we've been having conversations about the webinar ahead of the webinar. So I'm looking forward to the conversations during the webinar that we will have about how countries are working on gender sensitizing policies and their actions that are on the ground. A bit on the webinar series that we are doing. So I'm from Sri Lanka Trust. I'm Wasita, and we are part of a regional research that focuses on adaptation NDCs and loss and damage NDCs. And we work with Prakriti Resources Center in Nepal and ICAD as national partners. And Sri Lanka Trust is working at the regional level to bring together the research on NDCs implementation. So as part of this research, we have identification of gaps in implementation of NDCs, then how it integrates different concepts like gender, sustainable development, as well as institutional enhancement. So a bit about Sri Lanka Trust, if I may. So you can get more information on us from our website, it's srilankantrust.org, but a bit on us. So we are a trust, as the name goes. We used to be a network working on youth, mainly on climate change and youth since 2009, but we converted into a CSO since 2015, and we work on research, policy, and advocacy, as well as on the ground work related to climate change and sustainable development. And the issue of gender is one of the main things we focus on. It's important for us. In most of the work we do, we have a gender component, capacity building, awareness creation, and also we constantly work on how policies and actions could be gender sensitive and also gender responsive. So today we have a very interesting list of speakers. I'm not going to take a lot of time from your webinar time. So we've got the keynote speaker, who's from the UNFCCC Secretariat, Fleur Newman, and then we have three more presenters who will be having case studies or contributions to the thematic focus of this call. So we got Sandali Gomez from Sri Lanka Trust. She'll be focusing on NDCs in Sri Lanka and how gender sensitive they are. And then Sneha Rai from Prakriti Resources Center. She'll be speaking about some of the work they're doing with local communities and how gender plays a role in their work. And Tuga Al-Skari, she's representing Issue Resilience Global Partnership, and she'll be speaking about the gender working group of the Issue Resilience Global Partnership. So let's go to the next speaker, who's Fleur Newman. She'll be speaking, she's a keynote speaker, and she has a very elaborate presentation on many things that UNFCCC does on gender. I'm sure I have a lot of questions already for her and for everyone else. So I'm going to pay attention now and shush. Okay, let's move to the next one. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Right, so trying again. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today about the international framework for integrating gender considerations into work on climate change and how that relates to national action. And the previous presentation has illustrated some of the points that I'll talk about. So that's great. My aim is for you to take away from this presentation a better understanding of the problem we're facing and how working on gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment can contribute to the just solutions that are needed for addressing this. So then to the problem. I'm sure everybody on this call understands the urgency of the problem we face. The science is very clear. Humans are causing the planet to warm and the climate to change, and it's predominantly due to our reliance on the fossil fuels that have underpinned economic growth since the Industrial Revolution. It's a climate that has been safe for our entire human existence. In fact, all of human history has been in a colder climate than now. Human activities are estimated to have caused approximately 1 degree of global warming above pre-industrial levels, and it's likely to reach 1.5 degrees between 2030 and 2052 if it continues to increase at the current rate. Climate change increases risks related to health, biodiversity, livelihoods, food security, water supply, human security, and economic growth. In other words, everything. So to that point about needing to build capacity of municipal councils, it's critical that we do, in fact, reach everybody in this. So what's gender got to do with it? The issue of how climate change impacts on vulnerability and resilience was considered in the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Inequalities such as those experienced due to discrimination based on gender, together with other societal inequalities based on age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, among others, are exacerbated by the impacts of climate change. This year, the UNFCCC Secretariat prepared a synthesis report on the differentiated impacts of climate change on women and men, based on submissions from countries, UN, NGO, and civil society organisations. The data provided in those submissions supports this finding of the IPCC. And this vulnerability is not some inherent quality that women and girls, in this case, possess because they are born female, but rather it's as a result of discriminatory patriarchal rules, norms, customs, and institutions, which result in women and girls, and in the case of other people who are marginalised for other reasons, being excluded from participating in decision-making and community processes, having limited access to resources and assets, having an unequal burden of informal and unpaid domestic and care responsibilities, limited access to necessary sexual and reproductive health and care, for example, in natural disaster situations, and increased exposure to gender-based harassment, violence, and even forced early marriage, and impoverishment, including when male spouse migrates or otherwise leaves the household. But beyond vulnerability, the climate crisis that has been caused by the actions and inactions of humans has been, we're speaking about decisions that have been made in parliaments, company boardrooms, and societies where men and women have not necessarily been equal. To make the urgent transition, we cannot afford to exclude half of the world's population from contributing their ideas, and this seems obvious. And that in this, the challenge to the status quo and to provide their perspectives. So this crisis also presents a unique opportunity as we make this transition. We can advance goals for gender equality, not only for the benefit of people, but also the planet. Gender analysis is a tool which is more complex than these questions that are on this slide or the pictures that are there. But at the foundation of it, its purpose is to understand the power dynamics of a given situation so that policy and action can be more inclusive and more effective. So in transport and urban design, understanding who is using transport, how they're using it, and how they would adapt to changes in transport if they were given a choice are important things to understand when developing policy. Equally, stakeholder participation should ensure that it is not only those with the loudest voices or those who have traditionally had a voice in community who are participating. At this time, we need everybody to be contributing. And it's the same whether it's government or the private sector or civil society. And that goes down to the individual, consumer and community choices around renewable energy and choices around whether or not to make changes. At the international level, parties to the to the Climate Change Convention have recognised that more needs to be done to ensure gender-responsive climate policy and action, as well as gender balance in international negotiations on climate change, and that this can contribute to greater ambition towards meeting the Paris Agreement goals, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. In that, they have agreed a 3-year work program known as the Lima Work Program on Gender, which is an extension of the original one that was agreed in Lima in 2014, and a 2-year gender action plan to support these goals. This was after a long period of time in which the only decision that had anything to do with gender or women was one in 2001, which looked at the increasing participation of women in the process. We've moved on since then, and the Gender Action Plan, and some of these, the reason why this may look familiar to and sounds familiar is because in the last presentation, there was a discussion around capacity building, knowledge sharing and communication on women's leadership and participation and gender integration. So these 5 priority areas under the Gender Action Plan are actually based on 60 decisions or mandates under the international process, and they've been collected into these buckets of areas, priority areas, and they are intended, the activities in those in the Gender Action Plan are intended to support national action in those areas. And both the Lima Work Program and the Gender Action Plan are under review this year, with the expectation that at COP25 there will be a revision and an enhancement of both the Work Program and the Gender Action Plan based on the lessons learned from the past 2 and 3 years. And as a reminder, the Paris Agreement is something that all parties have agreed. We have a 1.5 ambition, keeping global temperatures to 1.5 degrees, with a pledge to keep them well below 2 degrees. And across all of these areas, across mitigation, across review, finance, impacts and adaptation, you will find a gender perspective. In fact, in the development of the Katowice, the Paris Agreement implementation guidelines in Katowice, which is in the next slide, we saw again an increase in understanding where gender might be taken into account. And that includes across technology, mitigation, adaptation, climate finance, and transparency. There's a growing understanding within the international process of what this means to take gender into account in the context of climate change. And I think the other presentations that we'll have today will illustrate more concretely what that actually means, and that it is something that is gaining attention and commitment from countries at the international level. And the expectation is that by taking gender considerations into account across all areas of climate action and policy, it will enable countries to raise their ambition as is needed, because climate policy and action would be more effective, because it's more inclusive, but it's also gaining the advantage of new ideas that may not have been taken into account in the past. And I'm just going to land on the last slide here, which is just to let you know that on the UNFCCC web pages, there is a dedicated space for gender and climate change. And in that, we have pulled together information that we've received through the process, a collection of resources and information guidelines and that sort of thing. And we would welcome you using that as a resource as you go forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Fleur, for that presentation. It was quite informative. Would you like to ask questions from Fleur? If yes, please type your question in and we'll feature it like before. So we'll wait for someone to type a question. And until then, I would like to ask a question of my own, if that's okay. Fleur, could you explain how when working with countries in putting gender into practice in policies and NDCs, what have been the challenges and what kind of capacity has been needed so far? Because we've realized that sometimes it's difficult to get the knowledge across on how gender sensitizing or gender responsive measures could be taken. Could you just elaborate what kind of challenges have been faced and how you overcome them?
Sure, and I think at no point in the presentation did I suggest this would be easy, but there is a lot of capacity building. I mean, and in fact, the negotiations on the review of the Gender Action Plan during the SB session in Bonn in June, one of the things that came out very clearly is an understanding that capacity building is a critical element of being able to do this work. And it's capacity building not only of climate change policymakers or those involved in developing policy and action to understand what the gender connections are, but it's also those who are working on gender equality and women's empowerment, women's and girls' empowerment issues, understanding how their work actually relates to climate change. Because in many cases, the work that they're doing will contribute. So whether it's ensuring that girls are educated or whether it's enhancing access to technology in disaster response or any number of different activities which have been traditionally seen as gender equality issues also have a contribution in the context of addressing climate change. And that piece of understanding what all of the connections is sort of foundational to being able to implement it. Another challenge is ensuring that you actually have the gender expertise available in order to do that. And this is why, in part, ensuring that gender equality experts are understanding climate change is so important.
In questions on the screen, you could answer them as they come.
Sure. So the question is that social vulnerability is something that requires detailed understanding to create responsible gender responsive planning. How do you suggest to include engaging diverse women's vulnerabilities into consideration? And this is the point of gender analysis, is to understand the gaps or where the power imbalances may be. And this is also a key piece to this is ensuring that there is effective stakeholder consultation. One of the things that came out of the submissions that we did for the synthesis report is that unless you ensure that you are engaging with communities in a way that allows a diverse range of people to be able to communicate and to be able to put their view forward without risk of either not being heard or being penalised within the community for their views. Those things are definitely things that need to be taken into account in the way in which stakeholder engagement happens. That's a very simple answer. That's a very shallow answer to what is quite a deep question. A very good question. This is, in fact, one of the conversations we've been having at the international level around the fact that of all of the NDCs, the INDCs prior to the Paris Agreement, an assessment of those is that the only ones that refer to gender or women are those from developing countries. There has been a growing understanding in developed countries, so global north, that in fact gender equality issues and women's empowerment issues are still a challenge in these countries, and that by addressing the issues, there will be they would also have more effective policy. And an example of that is that a survey of European households indicated that women-led households are statistically significantly more energy efficient than male-led households. And that has implications for policy. So at the moment, no, we don't have necessarily a good example in the NDC, but we have seen Canada, for instance, has implemented gender-based analysis across all of its government budget and policy making in the last 18 months. And there are a number of other countries who are looking at the way in which they're addressing gender, and hopefully we will see a lot more in the revised NDCs that come through in 2020. Okay, what can we expect? So at COP25, the review of the Legal Work Programme and the Gender Action Plan will be finalised with the expectation that there will be a new decision, or there will be a decision which will extend and enhance both the work programme and the Gender Action Plan, probably in one document. And by all accounts, parties are taking very seriously the lessons that have been learned so far, which were as part of the review. There was a workshop organised at the June sessions, and you'll find all the information on that on the web pages that I showed on the presentation. And there's a growing understanding of, or a more nuanced understanding of where the gaps are and where support should be provided through the Gender Action Plan. So our expectation is that there will be both a robust and perhaps more sophisticated action plan at COP25.
Okay, thank you, Fleur. So we'll park the questions for Fleur now, and we'll go to the question and answer session after somebody's and Tuda's presentations.
So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present. And I really appreciate the presentations that came before me, certainly very informative for me. So today I'm here to talk about the Ensure Resilience Global Partnership. I am trying to get to the next slide. Let's see. Bear with me one moment. That seems to be working. So the Ensure Resilience Global Partnership was established at COP23 in Bonn with the vision of strengthening the resilience of developing countries and also to protect the lives and livelihoods of poor and vulnerable people against the impact of climatic disasters. The objective of the partnership is to enable more timely and reliable disaster response through the use of climate and disaster risk finance and insurance solutions. So essentially ensuring that funds are made available to governments, sub-government and individuals in a timely manner to ensure that they're able to address disaster impacts rapidly. The partnership is currently comprised of 67 members that together form a grand coalition of V20 and G20 countries. The private sector, multilateral organizations, civil society, academia, and also other networks and initiatives that are involved in this space. Together, we're navigating with a clear vision, with a focus on strengthening the resilience of the poor. This year, we have a new vision, which was approved by our high-level steering board, Vision 2025. It outlines some key objectives relating to the overall vision of improving disaster risk financing and insurance. but it has two cross-cutting themes, two cross-cutting objectives. One of them is what we call the pro-poor approach, which looks at the impact on people. It puts people at the center of our work, even if we're working at national levels, even if our partners are implementing programs with governments or the private sector, recognizing that the ultimate objective should be the impact on the poor and vulnerable. The second cross-cutting objective is gender, and this is something I wish to speak about today. Our work in gender began last year. So we were established in 2017, and as you can imagine, the first year we were rallying support and growing our membership. And one of the first activities was the commissioning of a background paper that looked at gender inclusiveness in climate disaster risk financing and insurance solutions that exist. And this initial research found great gaps in these schemes. They were essentially, most of them were gender blind, and this caused great alarm. We are mobilizing these projects. We are putting significant funding behind it. When I say we, I mean as the community, this grand partnership, including multilateral development banks and the major donor countries. And to do so without understanding whether we are targeting gender appropriately, whether we are exacerbating gender inequalities is very, very significant and serious. So it became one of the higher priorities immediately at the first high-level consultative group meeting. The high-level consultative group is the steering group of the Ensure Resilience Global Partnership. It's made up of ministers and significant figures that represent our stakeholders. And they mandated us to establish a gender working group and also to elaborate on that initial background paper to better understand how women are being excluded by these programs along the whole chain. Where are the gaps? Where have we not understood the particular needs of women? We've been so we commissioned a second study, which is now underway. We are also working with our partners. We spent quite a bit of time speaking to different stakeholders to better understand their experiences, to better understand what they think they might be able to contribute to this space. And we've mobilized a gender working group, which we kicked off just yesterday, actually. And some of the members on this call are part of that group. And if anyone is interested, I would encourage you to join the Ensure Resilience Global Partnership and join us, contribute to this space, which seems to lack which has gaps in information. The initial work of this the initial objective of the working group will be to come up with a partnership commitment and statement and an accompanying action plan, looking at all the different stakeholders existing in our partnership and how they could take on this gender inclusive approach to their work. Based on this, we will also come out with a policy brief and look at the three major policy entry points in our space. So that looks at the macro level, the micro level, and also the meso level. The study that I mentioned has been very intensively engaged with members of the partnership and other experts through interviews and also through inputs to better understand the landscape for gender in climate risk insurance models. And in addition to this, we already began trying to improve the engagement of women in climate risk insurance. And this year we have sponsored a scholarship for a woman who is from the Insurance Regulators Office, a senior person who is now benefiting from a program in the UK, and she could take that back and improve decision making and her role within that. We will continue the scholarship program in years to come. And I recognize the topic of this session today, so I wanted to just draw on how we fit into the broader NDC partnership. The NDC partnership fits very nicely with Ensure Resilience Global Partnership. On the one hand, the NDC partnership, through its support unit, works towards surfacing the needs around mitigation and adaptation of developing countries and matchmaking with public and private institutions. Within our scope of focus, we look at encouraging the solutions. We look at trickling that through our membership. And so we are currently in engagement with the NDC partnership to look at how we could better connect and ensure that we respond to the demands that emerge and are communicated through the NDCs. So that's my very short presentation. I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Yes, certainly. So thank you for this question. I actually think we could probably write a book to answer this question. When I first read the background paper on gender, I was rather disappointed and quite worried about the situation that we found ourselves in terms of gender inclusiveness. But since then, as we've been speaking to our partners, we've learned of some very great initiatives that have been taken. So one of them is the African Risk Capacity. This is based in South Africa. It's an African Union initiative that provides at the sovereign level disaster risk financing for governments so that they could effect humanitarian action plans immediately after a disaster. The African Risk Capacity have, in the last few months, undertaken visits to 9 countries to better understand how gender could be better included into the implementation plans linked to the insurance policies of ARC. So ARC stipulates that each country that takes out insurance requires a contingency plan that is linked to the payout that would be given from the insurance product model. And in speaking to these 9 countries, they didn't just speak to their client, the government. They went to the grassroots, they spoke to households, they spoke to community leaders, they spoke to the private sector at the local level and looked at the entire chain that the funding would need to move through to look at these gaps. And on this basis, they have now developed a gender policy. The first presentation today, actually, Sneha, I really appreciated the bottom-up approach, ensuring that the grassroots women's groups were driving the process. And this is something that I think ARC has gone for, which I really appreciate. There are many other interesting initiatives where products are bundled instead of just selling insurance. One of the findings, for example, in the background paper was that often women have many risks to manage in a household. And sometimes the man in the household may have more limited focus on the land, for example. So the single peril products that are being offered, the drought only, for example, when someone goes and sells insurance to a micro level household, when it's drought insurance, the uptake of women is significantly low. Whereas if you bundle that with a multi-peril and different risks, that was seen to be very useful. And there are some initiatives working in that way, part of our partnership. I think I've spoken quite a bit, so we could probably move to the next question.
Yeah, so that it just relates directly to gender. So I think we could skip that unless you want to answer it.
Sorry, which one?
Well, it's on the screen because it's on no conflict of interest, and if you can see that.
Yes, okay. I could go for it. So we have a very specific mandate, and what we are doing is we're encouraging the private sector to come in and offer capacity for these insurance products. We crowd them in by leveraging public sector funding. But what we have is we also have a very close collaboration with the Insurance Development Forum, which is an insurance-led initiative. And we are increasingly having discussions specifically relating to this issue of mitigation and the role of business partners. This year, AXA, which chairs the Insurance Development Forum, announced that they will no longer invest in coal. We think this is good practice, and of course more can be done, but there is a dialogue around that. While it's outside our direct mandate, we are very engaged and supportive of such steps by the private sector.
Okay, hi everyone. It's a good evening from Nepal. I'm Sneha Rai. I'll be presenting on gender and climate change from the experiences of Nepal. What we as an organization we are doing on the ground. So I'm representing from Prakriti Resources Center. So let's get started. Okay, just to brief on relation of gender and climate change, we can see gender and climate change through two different lenses. That is women as a vulnerable group and women as agents of change. I'll be talking about this in more details in further slides. So women as a vulnerable group, as in case of Nepal, so in case of Nepal, in any climate-induced disasters. So okay, in case of Nepal, in any climate change or climate-induced disasters, there are more women casualties than men. Because of their social roles. There is no exact reason why women casualties are more than men, but because of their social roles and responsibilities, and because of their nature and limited mobility, women casualties are more than men. Also, in post-disaster, sorry. Also, in after post-disaster, women are more vulnerable than men, precisely the lactating women and pregnant women. Also, in rural Nepal, there are more women engaged in agriculture than men. There are also reasons because there are also some of the other reasons like there less access to resources and rights, property rights, and also in decision making. So the other column is on women as agents of change. Why women are considered not only vulnerable group but also the agents of change. It's because more women in case of rural Nepal, they are the first to feel and experience and also to respond to climate shocks. As I've already mentioned, and that in rural Nepal, more men are migrating for employment abroad or in urban areas. So this leaves the women as the head of the family. So they are the first one to respond to these climate shocks, and also they are the ones and they are the main who manage the resources for the families. So in case of Nepal's NDC, priority sectors like forest and agriculture. In case of Nepal, women are more related and more near to these sectors than compared to men. But no gender-based analysis has been done in case of NDCs of Nepal. So, for example, in forestry sectors, rural Nepalese women are the ones who are responsible for carrying out the daily chores, and they are heavily dependent on the natural resources. The same is for agriculture as well. So, some of the initiatives done by Prakriti Resources Center, like we are working with women's groups. We are working with local women groups, and we are engaging them in a way so that they could influence the local government for and so that they can influence the local government plans and policies, and they can take forward the actions of climate actions and environment actions. So this is the objective of our project. So further, we have a total of 4 results. Compiling result 1 and 2. Capacity for result 1 and 2 mainly refers to the capacity building, sensitization, orientation of those women groups so that they could be engaged more with the local government, and they would be able to influence their planning and budgeting for climate actions. And in case of result 3 and 4, we are trying to create a common platform for CSOs that are working in women rights and climate justice separately. So in this platform, they could come together and work on policy and advocacy, knowledge and sharing, and so and so. So the our main strategy for to work on the ground is, in the first phase, we are trying to sensitize, orient these women so that they could build their capacity, and they could understand about environment, regarding sustainable development, and also climate change and the link between climate change and gender. In the second phase, we are trying to orient these women group through training, and for local level planning and budgeting, so that they could be able to influence the local so that they could be able to influence the local level planning and budgeting for any climate change actions and environment actions. The third phase, we are trying to advocate these women through meetings and delegations, so that they could be able to put forward these discussions in a bit of a bigger platform. So yeah, and regarding the climate and development dialogue, we are a group of 10 member organizations of we are loose networks, CSOs. We are working on creating a platform where these organizations working on women's rights and environment come together to discuss for policy actions. So yeah, I think this was my really short presentations. If you have any questions, please.
Okay, thank you, Sneha, for the presentation. We'll take 2 questions for Sneha now, and then we will connect with Fleur. If you have any clarifying questions related to what Sneha presented, we could ask now.
Hi, the first question is, do you find women are need to be a part of the project? Yes, definitely. They are very need to be a part of the project, and they want to learn more about climate change. They want to learn about, like, they want to understand climate science, but it's really difficult to make them understand what exactly is climate change, like what exactly is climate science. But yeah, they are interested in knowing. And so during capacity building, it is very difficult to make them understand about climate science. So we have developed a resource book. Um, it's It's very simple, written in simple language, also written in Nepali language, so that it would be easy for them to understand. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you. Shall we get the next question if you have another one? Yes.
The second question is, during the engagement of municipalities and ward government offices there, it's really difficult to influence their understanding about climate change and all, because at municipality level and ward level there is limited budget allocation for climate change. And yeah, but it's very important to capacitate the local government officials as well.
Thank you very much, Sneha. We'll take more questions for you during the discussion time. Okay, so it's unfortunate that Sandali is not able to present today. We'll try to get another recording for her, and then we can share what her presentation contained, so you could get an idea of what we were going to talk about in terms of Sri Lanka's NDCs. We can open the floor for a few minutes for general questions if you have any questions for our speakers who presented so far. If you have anything to ask Fleur, Tuga, or Sneha, now is the time. So until someone types a question, I have a question for Fleur. So in the case of mitigation NDCs, there's a common comment that if we do not specify beneficiaries and it's applicable for everyone, that it's not a gender-lined NDC. How would you address this? Do you think it's the case, or if it's not, how do you address this? Fly, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sounds good.
Great. The issue with saying it's just people, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be gender blind, but because taking gender considerations into account isn't the status quo, it isn't the normal thing to do. It is, unless there is some conscious thought about, and conscious thought through an expression in policy about it, then there is always going to be the risk that gender will not be taken into account. So I think it's always going to be safer in terms of ensuring that if a country wants to have gender included in its mitigation action, that there is in fact an expression of that expressly in the NDC. And it may be that, and this is something that's coming out of the experiences in developing gender responsive NDCs there's a UNDP pilot project which has 10 countries in it. And one of the things is that you don't necessarily need to take on all sectors at once. If a country is not able to take on the work that's required in order to make something gender responsive, it may be useful to identify a few key sectors like energy or transport or agriculture or whatever it is, and use that as a kind of pilot for working out what the institutional framework needs to be, how coordination happens, how it's funded, those kinds of things. And then expand it out into the NDCs. It doesn't necessarily have to be done all at once. But as I say, I think in order for something to actually be gender responsive, there needs to be clear political direction as well as technical.
Just to follow up on the question, so you mentioned in your presentation that there's a lack of capacity, or it's been highlighted the need for capacity building. by countries as well as other entities on how gender could be integrated into NDCs and climate action. So are there any steps taken? For example, you have for NAPs and NDCs regional workshops. So do you have this sort of trainings for gender, or do you integrate this to other trainings that are ongoing? Or do you have like a guideline thing that could be introduced, like the national communications guidelines for preparation? Is there something like that people could look and get help from if they don't have much knowledge on what to do in integrating gender into policies and actions?
Thank you. There's not a specific guideline at this stage for integrating gender in NDCs, but one of the outputs of this UNDP pilot is going to be some guidance in that respect. It's a multi-year project, so that guidance won't be available just yet. But for instance, the guidance on integrating gender or making national communications gender responsive includes some entry points that would also be applicable in the context of NDCs, for instance, around the institutional framework. So how you ensure that you have coordination, which also includes, for instance, the Women and Gender Ministry or the equivalent or social ministries in the development of climate of the national communications. That same framework and capacity building that would happen with that could also then be applied to other aspects of climate planning. There are going through the NDC partnership, which we had referred to, also has a knowledge portal which has tools and guidelines on it, and I can send you the link for that if you'd like to share with after. And on our web pages, we have sort of tried to curate a little bit the information that we have, the tools and guidelines that we have. We actually prepared a synthesis report also on the guidelines and tools for integrating gender into climate. And what we found at that time, that was a couple of years ago, in 2017, I think, was that there are over 100 tools and guidelines for this in different sectors. So we tried to sort of collect those under topics, so under adaptation and under climate finance and technology, and those are on our webpage. But really, particularly when you're getting started on this, there is a need for engaging, either having someone employed or engaging consultants, or having gender expertise available when you're first starting out. It's, I think, quite challenging to do if you're relying simply on the tools and guidelines, although it is possible. And there are a number of, so the UNDP project is one, but there are also other projects around that are looking at capacity building. And as I say, I think it's certainly something that will be the focus of activities coming out of the next generation plan.
Okay, thank you very much, Fleur. So I think we're closing on the time for finishing this webinar. I'll pass the mic to the other speakers so we can have closing remarks, and maybe Fleur could add your closing remarks last. So I'll start with Sneha.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining and having me here. I would also like to pass you the link of my organization. I'll type it in here, and you can go and check out our resource books and publications if you want to, and need more, if you need more information, you can email me. Thank you, everyone.
Fleur, would you like to add anything before we wrap up as your last comments or recommendations for what we're dealing with here?
Sure. I think you know, one of the things that, if we take nothing else away, we need to know that gender laws, norms, and customs are changeable, and that we have an opportunity here both to create more effective climate policy, but also to really move the needle on gender equality. And as much as this is a challenge, and it is a challenge, it's certainly also an opportunity.
So thank you everyone for participating today, and I would like to thank our speakers for their time and the discussion and all the questions and the recommendations and all the information that came from our discussion today. And I'd also like to thank our donor who's supporting this research project, Asia Pacific Network for Global Change Research, APN, for engaging in this activity, which allows us to have these webinars organized on different topics.